So the first vignette 1A and 1B, this is really all about digital identity, looking at online child exploitation, or just even adult and child exploitations from different perspectives, therapist verification, and effectively abusing positions of trust. And this is extra important in digital mental health spaces. We should be at the forefront of having standards in place, recommendations, because this is arguably where people come when they're most vulnerable and need the most help and could be manipulated. So what we're going to do is look at or talk about these vignettes. And in particular in vignette 1A, I should say that a person with lived experience has created these vignettes. And I'm extremely grateful for the effort that this person has gone to. And there's a quote that they said, there are different types of predators who lurk within digital mental health communities. So we know predators are moving around in spaces, in social media platforms, but this is just a little bit different. And so we need to really understand what are the different strategies. And so the vignettes really outline different types of predators or strategies that predators might be using. And I think this needs to be teased apart and really understood, and then to create safer spaces. So one of the examples is the obvious inappropriate predator, the friend or foe predator, and the mentor predator, which I think is extremely relevant, especially to providers. So what I want to do first, before I hand it over to the experts here, I wanted to look at this from a positive perspective and look at recommendations from the young person who has experience in this space, and just read those recommendations out to you and have a conversation about how we can turn this negative situation into a positive. And I should also just mention that we do have allies like IEEE Standards Association who are very keen to help us. So in addition to the providers that I'll come to as well, I think we can do something really special if we all come together and use all kinds of different expertise. So just to highlight the recommendations from a lived experience person, I think this is really important. This person says mental health sites and apps, especially ones that receive public funding, should be transparent with their site safety data. Online mental health platforms should track and publicly post site safety data so that users who access the site may make informed decisions about their own safety. This is especially important for parents who monitor their children's online access. Not only should these companies be transparent, but the data should be visible and easy to locate, not hidden. Point number 2. Mental health digital platforms that allow children under the age of 18 should be leading in setting industry standards for online safety. These platforms should post information educating their community about online grooming and how to seek resources for children or their parents in case of such grooming occurring while accessing the platform itself. Recommendation 3. Digital mental health platforms need to deal with challenges of user-based growth so that they don't become too big to fail, meaning that there's sufficient oversight and administrative review of internal safety reports, especially reports from underage site users who access the platform. And the final recommendation: if a digital mental health platform uses community volunteers to provide peer-based support, the platform should draft and post a volunteer bill of rights. This bill of rights should clearly address how the site manages inappropriate behavior and how the platform plans to keep their volunteers safe from harm. So thank you for listening to the words of this person with lived experience. And now I want to hand it over to our expert panel. So I'd like to start with John to hear your views on, or any particular angle that you've got on this.
Well, I could tell you this is that in 25 years, especially in the last 6, when it comes to exploitation, is that the amount of children, for example, that are on social media platforms that are getting groomed has increased 100% fold. And what people don't realize from a predator standpoint, and I know you're going to get into the vignettes, but the reality is that a lot more people, it doesn't matter if it's TikTok, Wicker, I could go down every app that there is. And the way is, it's a global pandemic, or, we talk about challenges today. Well, today your predator is your police officer. It's your next door neighbor, and the insidious way people do that. And what's happening is that today with internet and being online is people can't determine what's real or not. So from a predatory standpoint, it's very easy to groom children. Having spent time on the dark net and Tor, there are so many different platforms where today predators use these different techniques. And it really starts with matching language. And that's what got me really into the neuroscience aspect. But it's not just giving you a gift. It's just commenting. And today, because from a digital mental health space, is that we don't know who we are. So we're trying to live up to these expectations that we can't. And for children, it's a lot more easy to manipulate that as we go along.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. I wondered if I want to open this up to the other panelists just to hear their views generally. So over maybe to Gavin.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Becky. One of the things I've said from an identity perspective is the simple solution is stopping people from getting into the system in the first place. And without boring everybody to tears, the issue in the UK especially is the approach to identity is completely fragmented, and it has been for years and years and years. I mean, you only have to look at the way policing looks at fraud, and we're actually living in a fraud epidemic at the moment. So you very much got the private sector in terms of identity verification solutions when you're looking at platforms such as this that are actually leading the way, not just with the advances in technology, but they just seem to be far more agile than central government. So what you've got at the moment here in the UK is you've got a couple of things. You've got the online harms bill, but you've also got really the digital identity trust framework, which has just come out, the alpha version, the beta version. I think it's just come out on the gov.uk website. So that provides a complete framework for identity providers to work towards, with a view to being certificated and accredited. And it goes down even into nutting into the detail of talking about the intelligence that's gained from companies where you've got false identities being used in those kind of environments, and how that can feed back into central government in terms of an identity port, like an intelligence portal, which I think is really important, but I don't think we're there yet, and we're some way off of that. But yeah, the ultimate aim is to stop people getting into the system in the first place.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. That's really good.
Hey, Becky, can I just add to that, just
yes,
like real quick, is that, and he's right, the challenge is that all these social media apps, they don't have an age verification, they don't have identity verification, and that's what makes basically any predator to be any persona. So that is one of the big challenges today.
Okay, fantastic. Because, well, I'm going to go to Maria next, but after this, we've got two providers within the digital mental health space. So I want to see it through their lens, a supportive approach to helping them tackle this problem. So, but first over to Maria, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interested in what John and Gavin were saying. I come at it from a slightly different perspective, because I'm looking at this from understanding that the people who are predators are using psychopathic behaviors, basically. So, and we've got to remember that we've got about 3%, 3 out of 100 people may be psychopaths. I know that sounds a bit shocking, but it's a fact. And when you've got people like that, then they don't have remorse, or to quote Robert Hare, they have no conscience. So we're dealing with people who will use techniques like false teaming. The things that we have seen in the vignettes really clearly identify this. And we talk about them looking for vulnerable people, but actually, I just would like to say, I think we are, all of us, whether we're children or not, but particularly children, we're all of us vulnerable at some point in time. And when we're having a mental health issue, we're clearly vulnerable. And I think it's got to be really easy and culturally okay to raise concerns, because I think we have this culture where we feel like, yes, if we follow the rules, somehow that makes us not as cool. And somehow that makes it okay for people to push our buttons a little bit. One of the things that very often happens with psychopathic behavior is the first thing they'll do is tell you something about them that is sensitive, and then draw out of you, therefore, something sensitive about you. And I think these are little things that we, maybe not being aware of ourselves because this is going on in cyberspace. But these kinds of little behaviors are really kind of relevant to that vulnerable person. But as I say, I think we need to think less about vulnerable people, and everybody is vulnerable to predators. And I have been vulnerable to a predator as well. So, I'm not putting myself outside this. Every single one of us can be that person. And I think we therefore need to up the kind of recognition and acknowledgement we give to people who are, and I'm not going to say victims, because I don't think we should say victims. We should say targets. You are not a victim if you have had a predator go after you. You are somebody who has been targeted, and that is not your fault. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I don't know if that's helping add very much to the conversation. I'm hoping that it'll kind of add some other dimensions.
It is spot on, Maria. No, absolutely. Thank you. And I'm sure it resonates with a lot of people listening. So no, it's completely spot on. And it's all about different lenses and how people are tackling this yeah. So thank you. Now, I want to kind of come at this from a provider perspective, which I sort of mentioned briefly before. So we have Matt here and also Dan, but Matt first. I was just curious if you could tell us more, because I know you're working with lawyers based in Singapore, and if you could just comment on online exploitation, and not necessarily just for minors, but just abusing positions of trust and the role that the law plays in elevating safety standards. So just if you could walk us through what outcomes can we achieve with a legal protocol to help us in this space?
So first of all, the law is not very advanced in this area. So the lawyer tells me that he actually has to really study this. It's building a product from scratch. There's no template to work on, and he has to draw analogous arguments. So we look at the medical industry, there is a standard of care. Can we place something of that, like a structure, into this protocol? And I think the function that it can have on stakeholders is it can give a sense of reassurance. So you talk to a student who wants to be a peer supporter or peer helper, they will be worried, what if somebody dies under my charge? Am I liable for this? And then you think that maybe somebody higher up, somebody with a counseling degree, because they have some protection and insurance, they will maybe be less fearful. It's not true. They are actually more fearful. So the common question they ask is, what does the law say about this? And that's the question I asked the lawyer. And I think one of the outcomes that in that partnership, what we want to achieve is, look, we don't fully understand how this abuse of trust can manifest. The strategies and tactics of the perpetrators are evolving with the times. And they use the technology creatively to achieve their outcome. But I think there are some fundamentals that we can put in place. What does safe and responsible conduct look like that the community can align to, so that in the worst case, they become liable or they are associated with something negative? They know that they are on the right side of the law. We need to have that in no uncertain terms. And I think we need to also start to make the perpetrator work harder by thinking about the ways, the instruments that they have to target their victims. So, when I was looking at the recommendations that you were, and listening to you reading them out, I sense a lot of distrust between users and big tech or digital mental health platform. And I can understand that, because digital mental health platform, you deposit very sensitive data. But as a provider, let me say this, we are not the enemy. And I think a responsible provider starts from the position of aligning the interests with the victims, the potential victims. And we look at features and we ask, can we accept the worst outcome? So for example, my developer say, hey, Matt, Facebook created this feature. Many people are commenting, this will get you viral. And I look at this and I say, okay, but I don't understand how perpetrators can use this to abuse others. And I cannot accept the outcome. So I say, let's not build this, even if it means it's less viral. Another example I would say is, you look at the tech companies, a lot of the starting point of, like abuse and perpetration and the grooming happens in the private chats. And I think we need to ask those tech companies, why are these features not having additional safeguards? I think they are the enemy. We are the ally. And I think that is where the conversation needs to evolve. Sorry if this sounds like defensive, but I just want to put it out there that I think it's important. It's good that we are asking questions, but it's important to be very focused on where the audience is and ask a question to the right target audience and to see us as an ally.
Thanks, Matt. This is what this is all about, just bringing different perspectives. And then, hopefully once everyone's had a chance to say their view, and I'll come to you, Dan, then we can get a discussion going just to kind of fill in some of those gaps and bring in the audience as well. So that was really interesting from that lens, and from a different perspective of a provider lens. Dan, I wonder if you could walk us through not necessarily the legal side of things, but the more data side of things. So John was mentioning earlier, like natural language processing and just subtle ways. Maria was mentioning these expressions of bringing someone in with sensitive statements. How can we use machine learning and other kind of sophisticated natural language processing to drive that, or other techniques as well, social media, checking like verification of therapists? What do we do? Do we go to facial recognition? What can you walk us through your views on that?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I'm 100% on board with what Gavin set out there, that the first thing that needs to kind of be looked at here is, how is someone getting into the situation in the first place? What are they doing to be able to get to target somebody in the first place? And there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all perfect solution. I think it's going to be a situation of, don't make the great the enemy of the good. Constantly try to come up with this makes things 30% better, let's implement it. Next month we found the new thing, 10% better, let's do that. And just queue these things up over time. So the way that I was thinking about this was kind of, there's already the technology already exists. It's just at the moment it's being used for banks and very high-end expensive solutions in place. But actually we've been looking into facial recognition for therapist identity verification and authentication, and automatic identity checks for passports and that sort of thing. It's actually not that bad. It's almost the point where I think most people could feasibly start implementing these ideas. And so my take on it is, you kind of have to balance the sort of technical solutions that are possible against the level of vulnerability of the people that you're dealing with. So kind of like where Matt said, why are you not restricting, you being Facebook in this case, why are Facebook or anyone else not restricting the access to DMs? Because that's where this kind of thing's happening. It seems like an obvious kind of start point to play with this idea is kind of say, okay, and each user has a kind of vulnerability risk score, which is the kind of way I'm framing it. And then the person who's speaking to them, assuming there's a position of power and it's not peer-to-peer, because that's obviously a slightly different discussion, there's then a kind of identity risk score associated with that. So what we can kind of try to do is piece together a series of steps which will increase our confidence in the identity of the person coming in, and pair that with what we know about the level of vulnerability of that person. And it could be that there's like a series of thresholds that say, you're not allowed to interact with people given this disparity in those two scores or something like that. I mean, there's plenty of smaller steps that you could take for, I mean, I'm focused on more therapist identification at the moment, but if you say, where do therapists interact with their clients in a normal basis? It's going to be on lots of different platforms. They're not just going to do one thing. It's going to be, you use WhatsApp, you use Instagram, you use Facebook, you use Zoom, you use Teams, whatever. So integrating with all of those different systems, but then using that internally as a check to say, okay, you say you're this person, we may or may not have this facial recognition system to check you depending on the circumstances for that. We can then say, you've linked up to a Facebook account. What's that Facebook account? Does the name match? If we send you a code through your Facebook message, can you, if I then phone you on the phone number that you've got on the BACP website, can you tell me that code? And it's kind of becomes a little bit of a private investigator type game, but you can, there's steps that you can take to get a pretty good confidence of identity verification for the therapist, and then just come up with ways of automating that process and integrating it to match the risk that associated with any given client. That's sort of the direction that we're going with it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks. And thanks for teasing apart a therapist verification versus a peer-peer, and just recognizing that perhaps it might be slightly, I don't want to say easier, but
No,
just
easier is probably the word.
okay, a different, a more controlled environment. So yeah, no, thank you for that perspective. And Geoff, also, I'm just remembering your provider hat. I know your vignette too, but let's bring you in. I don't want to pigeonhole you. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, couple of thoughts actually. I just want to sort of link a few things together. So as a provider of a sort of a safe space, we're more oriented around providing that communication capacity between therapist and patient, and we're looking at the sort of sustained safety of that environment. And there's a few interesting things that come out. One is, how do you know that my developers are trustworthy? Because it's very easy for a platform provider to put ways in to collect additional information. How trustworthy is that software? How trustworthy is the platform? It's a really difficult thing to do. And one of the things that we did as a sort of startup and as a thought process was to look through various versions of the Hippocratic Oath and say, how do we translate that into a do no digital harm kind of ethics, which our developers have to sign up to on the way into the organization? That's sort of step one. I want to make a comment on AI on that, by the way. A lot of talk about, we can just use AI for this, that, and the other. There's a connection between that and what's called end-to-end encryption, which is a means by which we ensure the safety and security of the communication that's going on between patient and client. And AI undoes that because it effectively needs access to the data flow to do its job. So now you're actually potentially undermining the security and safety of the platform in order to add some functionalities. You've got to be very, very careful about the balancing act that you take when you go through that kind of thought process. And then I think a last sort of key point is that what's interesting about the online harms bill is that it puts in a requirement, and it's sort of a backdoor thing that most people aren't aware of, that providers of communication platforms like our own could be required by the government to put a backdoor into our end-to-end encryption. So what I put in to ensure that my engineers and my developers can't see what's going on in the communication between patient and client now has to have a backdoor put into it, which basically means end-to-end encryption no longer exists. And I think that's a very serious concern in the online harms bill that I think is a serious issue that needs, at least some kind of controls put in that says, there needs to be some reason to suspect, and also some transparency if it's, if that level of safety and security is being undermined by the regulatory environment. So a few interesting points around that.
Thank you, Geoff. And that's completely spot on to the themes of this conference, because I wanted to open with this live session and end with cybersecurity, but importantly to start with this as the first lab panel, this juxtaposition between protecting privacy encryption and then needing to see the data for predators, grooming, etc. It's just, how do we tackle this? So that was completely spot on with the themes, the opening and closing themes of the conference. And now I just wanted to return back to John, Gavin, others, just to kind of do a second round. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if anyone does, just flag them up. But just any additional thoughts before we leave this vignette, because I want to give it the time and attention. Any recommendations?
Well, I think I was just going to say from the standpoint of a grooming standpoint, and then even in mental health and being triggered, is what happens is, especially with your brain, what you see is what you believe. And today, I think that's a big challenge, especially with children, just being victimized. And when you talk about end-to-end encryption, I think that's the challenge, right? Because it's happening so many times on this platform, because that's where everyone is. So whether it's TikTok or wherever you are, I think the biggest challenge today is children can't live up to the expectations of everyone else and what they believe those expectations are. And that's what makes them vulnerable.
And I just kind of like reinforce that and what Dan was saying as well, with the whole fact that you've got this kind of trade-off of having all these secure solutions to get into a system with what is essentially usability. and how somebody can use the system and that user experience, and cost as well. But yeah, absolutely, just to reinforce what Dan said, like the whole COVID situation over the last 18 months has really accelerated what was an already fast kind of digital channel process. And so you're now finding all of your things like facial recognition, liveness checks, cross checks on documents, other kind of checks sitting in the background that are all going on, even for other complete, for things like shopping in some circumstances with age verification. So yeah, it's just going to grow.
Okay, thank you. If there's anyone else, but otherwise I just wanted to add a layer on top of this point. Jurisdiction wise and crossing countries, crossing borders, it just seems to get even messier. And I'm extremely worried about if the individuals in one country and the predators in another country trying to offsite them, entice them buying plane tickets. It's a very tricky thing. Who do you go to get the help? Any thoughts about that? Again, I'm trying to frame it as a positive thing. So what could we do to make it what it's not right now? Yeah.
Yeah, so Becky, just one thing from a digital identity perspective in terms of jurisdiction. You could be a digital identity provider in the UK, but you provide a worldwide service. So all of your anti-fraud measures, all of your measures to do like the facial recognition, the liveness, the document checks could all be standardized across the world. But what you have is you have different jurisdictions from, say, the UK to Australia to America, all these different kind of trust frameworks for digital identities that are all slightly different, that one company will have to get certificated against. So it's an absolutely massive piece of work just for one company to get certificated against certain frameworks all across the world, and an awful lot of money involved as well.
Okay, anyone else with some final thoughts? Otherwise, I've got vignette 2 all lined up, or anyone from the audience that wants to drop a question in the chat. Oh, Maria, yes.
This is just a really very brief kind of global conversation, really, rather than specific data security conversation. But I think, or addition to the conversation, I think that we have to remember that as tech developers, we're not just part of a culture, we're driving a culture. And culture has changed hugely, particularly for young people, with this digital age that we're talking about. So things that were from my childhood that would have been culturally acceptable or unacceptable are completely different now. And I think when we're looking at the Facebooks and people like this of this world, sorry to have to quote Facebook, there has been where do they come from? They actually they haven't even based the beginnings of their business on something ethical. So we've already got something that is actually a little bit broken in terms of the concepts behind it. We didn't come into it with an ethical basis. And what I see among the tech developers that I come into contact with is really amazingly ethical tech developers. I mean, this is why we've got this conference, right? So I think what Matt said is absolutely spot on. Don't confuse the friend with the foe in terms of the developers. And I think getting together and actually trying to drive cultural change is also part of the remit. As I say, to make it easier to say it's not okay. And that's something we have as a hangover from the old analog culture to the new digital culture. It's still not okay to say, who are you? Go away, because I don't want to offend you, or because I feel that I've shared something with you. So that would be my little take, my little end note.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, it's really good. And I'll come to you, Matt, in a second. I just want to say it's nice to reframe things in a positive way. And even providers, they're trying, by and large, in digital mental health spaces, we need to recognize that they're trying to do good, but it's just so overwhelmingly challenging. And we had someone drop in the chat language, for example, and just trying to understand and decode in different cultures, different languages. My culture is hip hop, and I could say a whole bunch of stuff that would make no sense to you, and I could get through safeguarding stuff. So, but I think it was Matt that was just about to say something. So I'll go quiet and.
Okay, I was going to say that from a user perspective, it could be quite difficult to determine where to place your data and who to trust. And I think one simple way to differentiate who is likely to protect your interests is to look at how the providers are making their money. That would be the one test I use. So for example, Instagram, your Facebook, your big tech giants, if their primary way of making a living is advertisement, there's no way they would not want to dig as much data as possible. But I can tell you from a person who develops systems, there are things that we can choose to not collect, and it's a value-based decision. So for example, I can choose not to collect IP addresses, even if technology enables me, because I think with the user, because I do not know one day how this might be hacked, even if I put the most comprehensive system. And as a rule, if I don't know how to protect this data, I don't collect it. And I think that that is one thing that user can ask. Why is the service asking for tons of information where the main purpose is just to share my life, for example? So I think that would be like a way in which a user can safeguard such information. And maybe the other way to look at it is, who are the founders? Who's the one driving this project? Do they have a good understanding of this, like psychological things? And do I think that they actually will think for my interest or leverage on my interest to make money for themselves? I think those are the basic questions that I want to leave the audience with, in consideration of what the platform could do for you. Not everyone is bad. So I just want to put it out there. Okay.
Thank you, Matt. Now, in the interest of time, I think we will switch to Vignette 2, but I do want to just pick up on the chat very briefly. Reporting, huge. And I think providers, let's all have a conversation, bring everyone to the table and just talk about what can we do to flag these issues, to have parents to be able to get right in and say, I'm worried about my child, et cetera, et cetera. So reporting, it's something that I think we can actually do as providers. So, but now I'm going to hand it over to Geoff, and I've co-hosted you. So if you wanted to show anything but over to you for Vignette 2, and people, you can find the Vignette 2 in the chat, and I'll just post it in again.
Brilliant, thank you, Becky. So let me just see if I can run through what this vignette is all about. So in this session, what we want to do is really open up the debate on what is and isn't ethically appropriate when digitally marketing online services and apps and such like to prospective patients and clients who are clearly potentially suffering a mental disorder. So our objective here is to help clinicians and those responsible for online patient safety and confidentiality to ask the right questions of their service providers, web builders, software platforms, etc. Given the way the internet works, the basic premise being that the service providers out there, they want to know everything that you do, when you do it, with whom. They track as much as they can, and they add it to a detailed profile that is shared with literally thousands of companies. The argument being it's for advertising targeting, personalized advertising targeting. But as per Cambridge Analytica, what we've really seen is that this profiling activity can really be used in ways to influence people, very inappropriately. And also, if we look at the fact that someone engaging in a mental health service has a risk of societal stigma, just by being known that they're engaging in that service, we have to really look at what we can do to mitigate and protect clients and patients' confidentiality, when essentially the internet itself is really fighting us every step of the way. So what we really need to do is understand a little bit more about how the internet works. We'll touch here a little bit on a few areas that some of the panelists might pick up on, and answer some debating and ethical questions like, cookies, trackers, should we use them? I did a quick review of over 60 online mental health service providers apps, direct to client type of solutions. Many were really clearly trying to do the right thing. Many of them unfortunately failed and still leaked out information. Some were blatantly engaging in a sort of non-confidentiality oriented tracking of the internet. And believe it or not, one with over 50 trackers and cookies, and that's from a company acting as a gateway for assessing apps and online services for mental health. So that's pretty scary when you look at it from that point of view. So I did a short video on that one that you can look up in the supporting pages. We have to also think about anonymity. Can we really assure it to patients, given that everything is addressable in the digital world? So I believe that the short answer is no. Anonymity is not a word that we should be using when we're communicating with patients and clients, because it's not what they think it is, which is an absolute surety of safety and confidentiality. So how do we balance our communication with the public and with potential clients in that sort of context? And really, our apps, are they really truly transparent as perhaps the websites theoretically are? They're not, but certainly are far more transparent than apps about what data they're sharing and who it's with. They don't really have the same consent models as we see on the web pages. You get consent for access to device services, but you don't get consent very often properly offered to you in the context of third-party data sharing. And social platforms, really, should we engage with them at all, given that their modus operandi is to track and profile people and build a knowledge and understanding of their state of mind in real time? So should we be adding to that with the way in which we do our marketing? And email, is it really a safe communications tool? We kind of use it by default, and yet the number of times I've seen highly confidential information being shared with clients who are using Gmail, who don't realize that the entire content of that email is processed by Google the whole time in order to build and add to that profile. That's kind of scary. And search engines, how do we help patients achieve even a modicum of confidentiality? Because everything you search is being monitored and tracked as well. I use something called Start Page. It pseudonymizes me so that Google doesn't know it's me making the search request. But how do we communicate with patients to, when they're looking around the internet for support and help, to do so in a manner that's really not adding to that profile? Or should we even be worrying about that? Is that not our concern? And lastly, SEO, search engine optimization. What are appropriate techniques? And here I want to really throw out a little vignette. This is based on a real world case study. I'm not going to name the names, but it's a mental health forum provider. And what they did was they created false posts with highly searchable titles. In fact, pretty much exactly what people are searching on. And then they use bots or some other mechanisms to upvote that on their own platform and give it lots of hits that in return ended up with that content, being highly rated on the Google search response engine, making it look like this was a, simultaneously highly rated service and highly sought service because the SEO says it is, and that creates a trust issue with those clients. Now, let's just say for a second that company wasn't saying anything untruthful in that. So is that manipulation of SEO okay? I think that's kind of an interesting ethical conundrum for how do we go about marketing in the digital age, and what kind of trust models we want to build into our marketing methodologies. So that's sort of core to it. Becky, back to you. You can handle, moving around to our contributors and see what their thoughts are.
Okay, of course. I have a personal preference for looking at the SEO, the search engine stuff, but I'm curious to see what the panelists pick up from that. Okay, and also while you're gathering your thoughts, because I kind of put you on the spot there, we've got a message from, let's see, Tara, just linking again with website tracking. So mentioning, I have complained about the law, a law society calling victims of domestic abuse to visit their website lacking encryption and profiling with cookies and no transparency, especially during COVID. People in-house using same devices, their web browsing is revealed to other members of the household, not realizing. So thank you for that comment. And then I think I've just seen a hand go up somewhere, or Matt?
Yeah, I was gonna comment on, actually I learned quite a lot from Geoff sharing. So I just asked my developer, can we make sure when we share data files it's de-identified and we do it through our platform rather than through email? Because I think you make a solid point that it is unsecured. But I think the point you made about tracker, that is something that it's the ethics of it is really very context dependent. So when we talk about, for example, suicide support, if we hesitate to intervene when we know this person expressed an intention to die, actually that is not the best ethical care. And if as a provider, I can track when I know this person under my watch is suicidal and I choose not to track. In that context, I wouldn't argue that I was providing the best care possible. So I think that's really the complexity when it comes to decisions like this. But overall, I agree with you. There should be no reason why we need to know. I often tell my user, I don't want to know who you are. In fact, it's a disservice to me because then I need to figure out how to protect your data and destroy them and how not to let it fall into the wrong hands. But I think we need to know some of the important metrics, like how you're feeling, what you say, so that I have a baseline measure of, for example, whether my training is delivering the right effect for my community, or whether there are possible abuse or harm that is created. So some low-level abuse I've seen in my platform is people write stuff like testing, lol. So there's some kind of abuse that does not constitute harm. But if I don't track this thing, I have no idea how people are attacking my site or making my community vulnerable. So I think some level of tracking actually makes the environment safer. So I just want to kind of provide a different perspective to what you have presented from case study.
Thanks, Matt. And I will come back to the panel in a second, but I've just dropped vignette 3 in here because it's sort of an extension of what we're speaking about tracking, the deep end of tracking, really. If someone has just been discharged from hospitalization, potentially at a higher risk of suicide, using actual surveillance techniques with consent, let's say, how does that all work? And who should be allowed to access things like location data, or if they're in a high risk location and things like that. We mentioned police officers earlier. Who's in a position of trust? Who should be knowing where someone is when they're most vulnerable and exactly where they are? So that kind of extends the spectrum a little bit of what Matt was touching on from the lighter end. Again, back to the panelists. I'll keep an eye on the chat, but if you've got any other comments on any of the vignettes, really.
Would you like me to speak?
Yeah, Maria? Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
That was really, really interesting from Geoff and Matt as well. And I do think it's really important to ask ourselves the question, how much information do we really need to take? Because so much data is collected that I really don't see how it is benefiting the individual, even where there isn't necessarily advertising or anything, which obviously should be a massive red flag. So with our platform, we really just don't take any data at all. But interestingly, you're quite right, you do need to have some data, obviously. And we like to look at, what we're looking at is the well-being levels, which are always changing. Well-being levels are always changing. So they don't actually provide an awful lot of usefulness to anyone apart from the user themselves. Nonetheless, obviously, it's really important to keep it secure. But I think that what's interesting about what the guys were saying there is, again, our thinking about how we even approach this, because in a way we've created something that is enabling people to abuse it. So we've created almost we've created the monster, right? So we have to kind of uncreate it and really think differently. And I think it's interesting that we've got this thing created and we're now trying to use it for good. And the problem is that already embedded in this is a lot of misuse, abuse, predation, and all of the rest of it. So that's kind of already got into what people are trying to do for good. But I would really, my call out would be mainly, before you even ask for information, you have to be able to justify that this information absolutely is going to do the one thing that you intend to do, which is to support the individual. And the other side of that, which is where I'm coming from it more, is all of what we're talking about here is helping people, I would say, who are already in the river and we're trying to pull them out the river. And I think we also need to make sure that we stop people falling in the river in the first place. And that's kind of my angle, which is the people that are potentially not vulnerable, we need to make sure they don't become vulnerable within this system, which sounds a bit like a big ask, but I think it's what we need to think about. We need to keep the people who are already okay safe, because they could easily become vulnerable in moments, in seconds.
Great, thank you, Maria. So we've sort of coming to a close now, and I'll happily sort of let it a last few thoughts, a last few comments, but we're going to start to wrap this up. But yeah, Geoff, go for it.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the feedback is really around, from both Matt and Maria, around data minimization. So many years ago, almost how many years ago now? Nearly 15 years ago, when I was building my first sort of social engagement platform, I decided that what was really needed in social engagement was trust, and I really did a lot of work to understand what trust really is and how you break that down, and then how to connect that into a digital implementation. And interestingly, I identified data minimization as one of the tools. But then when we actually implemented the platform, what I really found was data minimization was the tool. It has to become the point of innovation, right? For example, on a previous platform I tried to figure out how to deliver a location-based service that didn't know your location. Sounds like a crazy question. I technically figured out how to do it, and we did it. But the point is that because I understand how deeply insightful that location data could be in the hands of the wrong person used in the wrong way. And I think, if we can make data minimization, if we come out of this little session, just say, as our starter for 10, data minimization is the start point for any digital platform service in this sector, you're on a good pathway. You'll start in the right way.
Awesome, Geoff. Thank you. And I think we've got time for one more. Okay, otherwise I'll just throw in my own 2 cents. Yeah, why ask the PHQ-9 when you can ask the PHQ-8? If you can get your same effect size, your significant association, why ask that very deeply issue of suicide and that kind of thing? But John, would you like to say any last words?
I'm just going to say is that we talked about data. We talked about there's social responsibility, right? The challenge is that we're all globally into it together. It doesn't matter if it's the UK, Singapore, or the United States. The reality is that today that's where our world is. So I think those complex challenges call for solutions, but they call for multidiscipline. So I think the more you can get people to the table to come up with solutions, because like I always said, from the grooming perspective, is we can't arrest our way out of this problem. And today we're having people more victimized more than ever. So it's going to take us sitting down and coming up with some solutions for these complex challenges.
That's really powerful. We can't arrest our way out of this. And on that note, well, thank you to all of the panelists. And I think there will be some actions coming from this. And I'm looking to Matt and Dan in particular, but then circling back to the other panelists for their expertise and involving a lot of other people and support. So I think there are standards that we can make and make them from a global or different perspective across countries and have a look. So again, just to end the session by thanking all of the panelists. It's been a very intense and interesting and extremely important topic. So yeah, thank you all very much. And I will make the recording available as soon as possible. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and to the delegates, of course.
Thank you, Becky. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.